Hello, I'm Richard Litchfield, Chief Exec of Social Sector Consultants, Eastside Primetimers, and today I'm joined by the boss of one of the most cherished and visible charities that we have in the country. It's Martin Houghton-Brown of St John's Ambulance. Welcome, Martin. Thank you very much for getting involved in this project. As so many charities and social enterprises are now looking to review what they're up to and their model in light of both the health and the economic crisis that we seem to be in at the moment. We wanted to share some practical experiences and tips and ideas to people running organisations like yours up and down the country about how to reboot in the current environment. Today's topic is specifically about financial resilience, which needs no introduction to everybody as one of the key themes within the spectrum of building back better. We've got some stuff that we've just put out on our website and resources and tips if people want to look at that in more detail. It's at ep-uk.org. And perhaps to start us off and to maybe set some context for people who are viewing this, everyone, of course, has some awareness of St John's Ambulance, but it might not be the same for everybody. So I wondered whether you can maybe give a brief but more holistic view of the organisation today.
Thanks, Richard. Really glad to be able to just share and reflect a bit on what's been happening and what might be happening. St John's an interesting organisation. It has these sort of medieval roots, but was kind of like a lot of charities in our sector, was refounded or founded in the Victorian philanthropic era, and so it's about 140 years old, and it's been delivering in communities throughout that time. And so the teaching, training and delivery of first aid has come with local communities in mind. And actually where you find St John community, we call them units, but where you find St John in those places, it's often in places where industry was strong, so in mining communities, in industrial strongholds. So it's no accident that we're pretty much everywhere, and so it's actually it's not surprising if your local football club or your local garden fete or your banger racing or whatever it might be, there are St John First Aiders there, and they are community volunteers, but perhaps unusually, you do have to get selected and qualified to be able to go out. In COVID, we're constituted by a royal charter to respond to national emergencies, to aid government in times of war and peace. And so we're obliged to say, what can we do? And that's exactly what happened at the beginning of COVID. And phenomenally, as I speak now, St John has delivered 200,000 hours of volunteering effort to patient-facing activity. It's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes, fundraising and logistics and all of that, but patient-facing activity, 200,000 hours. It's a real privilege and honour to lead.
Thank you, Martin. What incredible work you guys are doing. For anyone running any not-for-profit over the last 6 months, it's been like an unbelievable and challenging time. How has the in-tray been for you? What's been top of your in-tray?
I think with your chief execing a £1,000 community organisation, and you're the lead, community volunteer, or 5 million, 10 million, or like St John 100 million. The thing that is uppermost in your in-tray are the people that you're working with, your volunteers and employees, because that they're the resource capacity, they're the people who make everything happen. And so absolutely top of my tray has been our St John people. And that's been both about the fact that actually we had to retool all of our people who were going to be front-facing, because we had to teach them more stuff about PPE, stuff about the virus, stuff about working in environments. So we're normally first aiders on football fields and at events, and or in my case at Pride, listening to Kylie, or helping out in the community with homeless projects or those kind of situations. We're not normally in hospitals triaging patients with COVID. So we had to deploy 40 hours of training for every single volunteer in a new care module that we had to design and deliver in a virtual world in, COVID secure conditions. So right high up on my list was, how do we equip, how do we empower, how do we enable people to get out there? And then, of course, as the money began to dry up, I had to think about, well, what's the impact on my employee workforce? Because whilst we're 30,000 volunteers, we're around 1,500 employees. And so what's the impact of that going to be? That very early decision about furlough, who do you furlough, how do you furlough, what do you do with that, how quickly do you move? So I think top of my in tray throughout the crisis has been our people.
Okay, thank you. And early, as you were saying, early in the lockdown phase, I know you kind of undertook a financial restructure. Could you give us a bit more information about that, particularly what you were trying to achieve through doing it?
So we're not a huge fundraising organisation, and so our net fundraising income historically has been about £7 million a year. Which, for a charity of 100 million is perhaps surprising, but that's because we've got really successful social enterprises. The two big ones are first aid at events. So, football clubs and commercial gigs and events, we charge them a commercial fee. And that pays for our volunteering and all of our infrastructure. And then we have a training business where we train people in first aid and we certificate people. And that's a very successful, very profitable business, a great social enterprise, delivering social good, whilst also generating a surplus. And that surplus, again, helps us to fund our cadet programs. We have 10,000 young people under the age of 18. We have university programs. We have homeless outreach programs. So all of that is mostly funded, actually, by a combination of the 7 million fundraising and then the surplus. And we're one of those few charities where actually the fundraising income does go straight to the front line, because the training surplus pays my salary and the infrastructure salaries. No events meant no first aid income, and no training, because the lockdown meant that it would be illegal to deliver training, meant that we had no income from that. So it was very clear that over the projected 3 to 4 months of lockdown, we would lose in the region of 20 to 25 million pounds. And that was going to net out, even after mitigation, at about 10 million pounds. So immediately I needed to make decisions about protecting the long-term future of the organisation. And one thing I feel, that all of us have to recognise is that as leaders, it is lonely, and we have to make very lonely and brave decisions. Now, our teams are wonderful and they will provide all the support in the world, but that, if the press come knocking, if the board come knocking, if, the challenge comes ultimately, people will think that the decision is yours, even if it's been a collegiate decision as it should be. So I went for it early, so I did 3 things really early. The first was that I used every bit of political capital that I owned and knocked on every ministerial MP and official's door to let them know that if they wanted us to deploy at scale with hundreds of thousands of hours of voluntary endeavour, they would have to not only pay the direct costs, but also help us to survive this pandemic as a charity. So we were, I think probably first in the queue for that 750 million that Rishi was dishing out. We were there long before Rishi had ever talked about that number. And you better believe that when he mentioned St John Ambulance at the podium on that day, it wasn't an accident. It was deliberately intentioned. And I've spent all my political capital now. I don't think any politician or any government official will ever speak to me again. But, we saved our bacon. The second thing we did was we emphatically recognised that there was a whole portion of the organisation that wouldn't be able to work because there was no training business, and there were proportions of the correlating activity in the organisation that wouldn't be able to work. And so on day one of furlough, they were on furlough, and it was just crystal clear that we were going to do that. We, in the early phases, topped up some of those salaries, or all of those salaries, but that phased out a little bit over time, but giving financial flexibility, things like being able to exchange holiday and things like that, that enabled people to get through those difficult months on furlough. And then the third thing we did was we began to plan, because there was always going to be a long-term impact. And we had to plan for the eventuality that this would not be a V-shaped economic recovery, but it would be a U-shaped economic recovery. And my view relatively early on was that it would be U-shaped, that given the profile of pandemic disease and the way that pandemic disease does have two waves and sometimes three, this would be a U-shape. And so, as you may know, we were relatively early to go to consultation on redundancies. And it was with huge regret that, I understood that we were going to be a smaller organisation in 2021 than we were in 2019. But it was inevitable that our training business would not be able to recover as quickly as we had hoped. The pandemic would leave us ready to. So the big ticket item about taking that consultation early was that I could go to our organisation, to our people and say, we've not made up our minds yet, but we know we're going to have to find this scale of saving. So we're going to work with you. And we knew that the modelling showed that it would be approximately 255 redundancies, and that's what we went out with. The press quoted us on that number. And we have been able to find those savings through a combination of redeployment, retraining, voluntary redundancy, and only 30 compulsory redundancies. And I genuinely believe we've been able to do that because we went early and we went and asked our people about the solutions. And they solved this problem. I didn't solve this problem, they solved it. And they listened, they understood, and of course there were lots and lots of tears shed on the way, and an awful lot of embracing each other as we went. But they designed the solution, delivered the solution, and the consequence is that St John is better able to face the future because they were brave and did that work with us.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, there's so much, I think, gold dust in those different elements that you were just mentioning, and we could kind of pick over, I think, any of them in a lot more detail. I mean, the political capital one made me smile, and I think a lot of organisations do find, even if it's not the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that it's really important for them locally, regionally, or nationally to be building those relationships and then using them, and how to use them. And it's never something that just happens. You've got to really proactively work at it. Do you mind if we talk a little bit about the communication side of restructuring and making change, which is always, I think, a difficult balance to achieve? Not only had you chose to go early, but you'd also been very public and open in the way that you'd communicated about it. And then since then, we've had a number of other chief execs, and I think they've followed the same course. And I don't know if it's directly related to that, but it feels like a pattern of the times for people who are leading organisations. Do you mind talking a bit more about that and why you chose that route?
If you look at the big challenges in history, you see that, whether it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa or the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, in times of conflict or challenge, it's where you engage with the community and ask the community for the solution that you find those solutions. And we're not on the scale of that challenge, but nevertheless, for St John, this was pretty catastrophic. This is a pretty challenging moment in our history. I think, as leaders, we're primarily employed to corral the capability of the organisation in a way that the organisation can be better in the future than it is today. So it can grow and strengthen itself. And there is a point about making those tough calls, making those tough decisions. And so, yes, of course, we do have to decide, but we don't necessarily have to have the answers. We simply have to find out who's got the answers in order to be able to decide. Therefore, a mistake to conjure up an answer about the financial future of your organisation in a dark room behind closed doors, deciding who is going to stay and who is going to go. And I think by going openly and honestly, and it's not without its problems, because of course I've had people who saw my testimony at Parliament, the false testimony that went out in the media that interpreted it as St John's going bankrupt. Of course that's come back to visit me, and I've had to manage that and steward that. But what was really important about that is it empowered St John people. And it actually also empowered our partners in the sector. It meant that I could reach out for help and assistance and support from other wiser minds. The downside is that the naysayers will still come after you. But you know what? They would have come after you anyway. So, at least this way you're empowered, because I get the power to speak to St John people, I get the power to speak to colleagues in the sector, and I get the power to tell the truth. There is nothing more powerful than the truth to create change. And so by using that openness and honesty, we were able to both change internally as an organisation, but also, I hope, change the government's view of the sector. Because if big charities like St John, who are big household names and brands, if they don't come out and say we're vulnerable, then is the government really going to listen? Because we know that it's easy to ignore lots of smaller voices. And so I saw it as my responsibility as a charity leader to say, actually, I'm one of many. And if St John is struggling, you have to consider the hospices, the youth centres, the YMCAs, the other charities in our sector who are also suffering.
And on that point, Martin, I welcome it. Others certainly have as well. We're now 6 months on. How do you view the outlook for the sector going into what looks like a second wave and then into 2021?
If we're smart about it, fewer charities, but stronger. And so what we've got to do is reach out to each other and embrace each other and say, right, how do we do this together? Because the need is going to be greater. And so, the need for our work in society is going to increase as a result of COVID. So the financial modelling won't work for us all to duplicate or proliferate, in particular our back offices, because it's expensive. Chief execs are flipping expensive. So we can't afford many of them. And finance directors, well, they are not to a penny. We can't afford many of them. And so we're going to need fewer infrastructure people. We're going to need fewer, offices to work in. We're going to have to lower the cost of doing our business as a sector. And that's going to be through mergers, it's going to be through partnership agreements, through service level agreements, it's going to be through accepting that we might need one board where we had two, but recognising that by looking out to others and saying we can partner with others, we can collaborate, we can merge with others. We had this phrase in the YMCA when I was chairing in the YMCA, amalgamating, because it wasn't merging. We weren't sucking someone up into one charity to say, well, you've been acquired. We were amalgamating the resource to create a better resource, a stronger resource, a broader resource. And I know you had Richard James on this series. A great example where YMCAs across South and West London amalgamated to create a stronger, more coherent service for the community. And I think what Richard's led in YMCA there in South and West London, that's a really good example of how our organisations, our sector, can rationalise for a different future.
Thank you, Martin. Great insights there on financial resilience and so much more. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thanks so much for the work that you guys are doing at St John's Ambulance. It's never more important than now. And for our viewers, if you'd like to delve into this topic in more detail, we've got more tools, resources and support on building back better on our website. Please do get in touch or visit ep-uk.org. Many thanks.